Cool. Well, hi, everyone. I don't know how many virtual meetups or remote meetups you've been to recently. It's kind of an interesting times, I guess. Usually, obviously, this kind of stuff for me is in person, but I've been doing a lot more of these remote ones, which has been pretty interesting, but also been a pretty good experience so far, speaking at a couple of different conferences and events and stuff. So as I mentioned this a second ago, as we go through this, if you have questions or comments, just throw them in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye out for questions there, and then we can take some formal time at the end to answer any questions that you have, and you can come off mute and do that kind of stuff. So the first thing that I want to talk about is just the fact that the phrase static sites probably doesn't mean exactly what you think it does. The landscape of web development has changed drastically over the 20 years. The tools are a lot better. The things that we build are a lot better. And things are just different. So when you hear static sites, you might think of something like a basic HTML page with just some HTML. So you've got a heading here and then a paragraph tag. Or maybe something a little bit nicer that has like headings and text and then links and images. Then something a little bit fancier where you start to add in CSS and you have like a grid-based blog layout here. And then the coolest example is something really, really cool. Back in the late 90s is the Space Jam website, which is actually still out there available today. If you're interested to go check it out, you can just search for Space Jam. But this might be like that. Those are the types of things that you might think of when you hear static sites. And regardless of which one of those you think about, if any of them, just know that that's not quite what we mean when we talk about static sites and kind of the modern landscape of web development. And we'll get into lots of different topics around the Jamstack and its kind of ecosystem, which heavily involves static sites. But anyway, regardless of which one of those you think about, we're in a much different world now. So I want to welcome you to the talk where we are going to, I'm going to show you just how dynamic your static sites can be using a technology that I'm particularly interested in and excited about recently the last several months in serverless functions. And we'll talk about how to build those and where to host them, and then how to interact with them from your client-side JavaScript. So a little bit of an intro. Obviously, James Quick here. I've embraced the middle initial of Q for Quentin because there is a football player in the NFL named James Quick, and SEO is all towards him if you search James Quick. So if you search for James Q Quick, you can find me online. And I consider myself to be three things: a developer, a speaker, and a teacher. And I've done a combination of those things professionally for about 7 years now. So I started off my career as a developer evangelist at Microsoft. Then I went and did software development at FedEx. And then just recently started as, back in January, I say recently, it's been several months, as a developer advocate at Auth0. So my job is basically just to get out in the community and kind of share knowledge and be a part of the community and go to conferences and speak at remote events and things like this. And that's been a lot of fun. And in addition to that, I am also a champion for a company called Twilio, which will see both of these, Auth0 and Twilio, as part of the demo. And I think this is a really cool way of just kind of combining these different things together. So anyway, if you have any, want to find me online on social media or on my site, everything is James Q Quick at Twitter and GitHub and Instagram. And then personal site is James Q Quick as well. So one of the things that I'm going to ask you to do, and this is for two reasons. One, just to get engagement on Twitter, I think is a lot of fun, but also this will factor into the demo. So during this talk, I usually kind of force people to at least do one tweet so it shows up in the demo and it doesn't look awkward if no one participates. So what I would like for you to do is, if you have a Twitter account at some point during the talk, tweet with the hashtag of JQQuickTalks, and then you can include my handle, James Q Quick, in that as well. And we'll talk about where that pops up in a few minutes, but it will be part of the demo. So hopefully we can get a couple of people to participate in that and have that pop up when we get to that point. So let's start off by talking about what static sites are, and what better way to start off than the truth, or the source of all truth, in Wikipedia. And Wikipedia states a static web page is one that is delivered to the user's browser exactly as stored. That's really the key there. And then it contrasts that with a dynamic web page, which are generated by a web application. And we get into this idea of kind of like traditional, dynamic, older, older styles of building websites versus a little bit more modern idea of static sites. And we'll talk about the differences in those more and more as we go through this. But in my mind, my definition of static sites, and you can kind of take this for what it's worth, but at least this is my interpretation. Static sites is a collection of static assets that are served directly from a server or a CDN. There's no real-time dynamic generation step needed. So you do some sort of build of your site, you get a static set of assets, and you can just copy those files off to any kind of host you want. We'll talk about one which is really, really amazing, which is Netlify, that I really like. But any kind of file host can host these files, and then you can replicate these across the world using a CDN, a content delivery network, so that things are really, really fast when people come to request your site. Question in the chat, can you list the hashtag and handle you'd like us to tweet again in the chat? Yeah, let me throw that in here now. So the hashtag is JQQuickTalks, and then the handle is JamesQQuick. All right. So after kind of, maybe that definition makes sense to you, maybe it doesn't. But after kind of defining what that is, at least to me and my perspective from what we're talking about today, then you get into the question of how do you make static sites? And I feel like this is probably a little controversial. In my definition of static sites, something like Angular, React, and Vue can be used to build static sites, because if you've used any of those frameworks, you typically end with a build process. So you run an npm run build or some sort of build script, and those frameworks will do like minification and combining files and assets and pulling in all the modules and things you need. And the output of that build is a set of files that then you can go and host anywhere. So those are static files that then get hosted on basically any kind of server that you want. Now, obviously, these frameworks are very, very dynamic. My point is that the output after a build in any one of those frameworks, you get a collection of static assets, and you can go put them anywhere you want. And we haven't really talked about this example yet, but we'll talk about it a few different times, is the example of like a blog site. And if you think about all of the pages on a really big blog, if there's 100 different blog pages, you're probably not going to write all of the code for each one of those pages yourself, because that would be really tough and tedious. And then if you want to update like a header or a blurb or something, you have to do it in all these different places. That's not what you want. And most recently, when you think about the Jamstack and we think about static sites, you think about static site generators. And these pretty simply are frameworks to help generate static pages. So thinking about the idea of the blog, again, this being a really common scenario that people reach for, mainly just because it's relatable and people can really understand how it works. When we think about that, that scenario, using a static site generator can basically do all of the automation or automatically create all the static pages for your different posts based on the data that it brings in. So one of the key things to know about how static site generators work is they still interact with a data source of some sort. So if you think about like a dynamic page, like a WordPress site. So when you make a request to a WordPress site, the index page, which lists all the blog posts, what WordPress does on the server is it goes to a database, it grabs all the information, and then it uses that information to render the HTML that then gets sent back to the user. With static sites, things are done very differently. There's still an interaction with a data source of some sort. Notice I'm not specifically saying a database because we'll get into why in a second. But the difference here is when a static site interacts with that data source. So let's do a little bit of a comparison between the two. With a static site generator or a static site, or specifically a static site generator, you interact with your data source at build time. So in your build step with a static site generator, what it will do is go to the data source, whatever that data source is. It will grab all the information that it needs, and it will use that to real time, or not real time, at build time, build the static pages, the static HTML pages for those blog posts, if that's the example of the data that we're looking at. So one of the big downsides of this that's a little bit tricky is you have to run a new build anytime you add new content. If you think about WordPress and you add something new to your database, going and refreshing the page, now since it's interacting with the database real time, you'll see that new blog post show up in your index page. However, with a static site generator, it doesn't work that way because things are created at build time. So you would need to run a new build each time you add content. And that certainly got pros and cons, but the overall benefits of static site generators are really, really nice. Speed, if you think about the lack of a real-time database interaction, these files are just getting requested and sent right back, and they can be replicated over a CDN. So it's basically just sending back files that are already rendered or already created, I guess. Security, because you're not having to manage a server and it's just files that are being served, there's really nothing extra that you have to worry about. So there's really a lack of a security concern there. And then development experience and ease of use is something in my mind for the applications, some personal ones and then some demo ones that I've worked on, is really, really beneficial. And you like, I almost can't overstate how nice and simple that experience has been. And you'll see a little bit more about that, why that is in a few minutes. So in contrast, your dynamic sites are real time and there's no extra builds necessary if you add extra data. So again, this is one of the benefits. This is probably the easiest way when you compare these, the easiest thing that's like, you probably want to jump towards that because it sounds like a hassle to run that build every time you have new content, but you'll find ways to do automation. We'll see that in a little bit as well. So the benefits here, no extra builds are necessary. And then this has basically been the established strategy for years. And tutorials cover this. Jamstack and static site generators are relatively new. This stuff has been around for a long time. So you can certainly trust that you can find a way to make it work. Not that you can't do it with the newer static site generator stuff, but it's just been around a little bit longer. So just wanted to mention here a couple of different options for static site generators. Nuxt and Jekyll and Eleventy and Next and Hugo. And then I save my favorite for last, which is Gatsby. And this is built on top of React. And I just want to clarify, I'm trying to start to change the way that I talk about Gatsby. Gatsby and actually a couple of these frameworks are not just static site generators. Gatsby has the ability to generate static pages, but Gatsby also has the ability to do basically anything that React can do as a framework. So they are really starting to focus on that branding, and I want to help support that to make sure that they are not just looked at as a static site generator, although that is something that they do. So I've mentioned the term the Jamstack several times, and I'll be really brief on what this is, but Jamstack, the acronym, stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And if you think about the way we've built applications so far, we've had JavaScript, we've had APIs, we make API calls all the time, and then we have markup and HTML. So this is like, in theory, this is nothing really new. The Jamstack really is just kind of a new way to think about how we build web apps. So kind of challenging the norm of what we've been used to, thinking about how we used to do kind of the dynamic generation of HTML. You certainly can still do that, but there is this new wave of static sites and static site generators and things like that. And then we also want to talk just a second about what serverless functions are. So this will mean more, I think, when we actually see some code snippets. But serverless functions doesn't actually mean serverless. I don't know how many people have experience in the serverless world or have used a serverless function or a serverless framework, but it doesn't mean there's not an actual server. There is a server that a function sits on. It just means that from your perspective, the developer, the only thing you have to do is write an actual function, and then magic happens. The platform that you host this thing on, in this case, in this demo, we'll use Netlify. Netlify, which actually is abstracting away the fact that it uses AWS. So under the hood, AWS is doing all the magic for us, where we just literally write a function included in our source code, check it in, and then that function gets hosted out there for us to use just like any other API would be if we had a Node server or a Python server or whatever type of server we wanted to create. The benefits of this are you don't have to like write out a full server. Again, you're just writing code for a function or a handful of functions. They basically equate to routes if you think about writing your own full server. And that's all you do, and the rest of it's taken care of for you, which is really, really cool. question on Twitch for Q&A. How do you handle security using the Jamstack? I mean, if you want to have roles and that sort of thing. Yeah, this is definitely a big question. I'll get into that a little bit on inside of this talk, because I am using Auth0 to make sure that what I will show you in a second is secure in terms of I'm the only one that can do the things. Well, we'll see in the demo in a second. So I will talk about that a little bit, but in general, this gets really interesting with Gatsby, for example. And I clarify that Gatsby is not just a static site generator. Gatsby can do statically generated pages, but at the end of the day, it ships React. So inside of React, you can basically do the same sort of authentication workflow that you were already doing. Now, specifically in the use case of like leveraging Auth0 to do this inside of Gatsby, there's a few subtle differences that you have to do inside of Gatsby that you don't have to do with just regular React. But at the end of the day, most of it just works the exact same. So with that question in Twitch, if you have follow-up questions to that, definitely let me know. And especially once we get to the kind of talking about the security aspect of this, feel free to throw more of those questions out here. All right, so the demo that I want to show you, and this is one that I'm really excited about. I've told people this several times. At this point in my career, I'm really just excited about learning about different pieces of technology and figuring out how to put them together to build an application. And there's so many different services out there that are so amazing. They're so much fun. Figuring out how to tinker with them and just build something is really what I get excited about. And today, this demo is an example of that. So what I've got is a site where I can track all of the talks that I give. So as I give talks at different conferences, I can have a landing page that has a list of those. They can click on one of those items to get details like where the slides are and what the description was and what the date was and that sort of stuff. But then I also wanted to add kind of a dynamic ability of people to add feedback. So as I add a new talk to this list, people who watch the talk, hopefully you'll participate in this demo, you can actually leave feedback. And this is one of the things that I think a lot of speakers wish they had more of. A lot of times when you give a talk at a conference, people, they might stop by and they might say, you know, I enjoyed your talk, and maybe they have a question, or maybe they just say, I enjoyed it. But rarely do you get like really constructive feedback. Now, hopefully this is targeted at like beneficially constructive feedback, but I'm open to things if they are constructive. But it's something that you don't really get access to very much as a speaker. So this is another way for me to try to solve that problem. And then we throw in a little bit of other dynamic stuff too, just to kind of show that we can, honestly, with the Jamstack, with static sites. And even tied into the authentication stuff that we've mentioned a little bit. So let's break down the different pieces of technology that we're using in here. First off is Gatsby. So this is a static site generator, and we'll see more about that as we go through this. Also want to clarify again, just one more time, it's a static site generator, but also a lot more. So it can do statically generated pages, which it's actually really, really good at, but it also does a lot more. And I think that will become really evident by how dynamic this static site that we look at is. So an example, code snippet in here from Gatsby is inside of the Gatsby node file, which you can think of as kind of like you can intercept and decide and write code of what to do during the build process. And so during the build process of this site, what I do is I grab the information about all of the talks. We'll talk about from where in a second, but I grab all that information, and then for each one of those, I call create page, and then you tell it, or actually in this case, this is creating the index page and then passing all those talks to the index page so that it can render it. And then also another snippet that I don't have in here, but I'll show you in a second, is the ability to create the static pages for the details of each one of those. So think of this as you have a list of blog posts, for example. You can click on each individual one to go to the details page and read the entire post. We'll have that same sort of layout for the talks here. And then I've been really generic in how I've talked about data. So I've been very specific to say, I've been very generic, but then I've been very specific to say data source instead of database, because what I'm using in this demo is Trello basically as my database. And if people have ever used Trello, you'll see it in a second, but it's an application that's really, really nice. I use it every single day to track my to-do items and different things. And it's got a really nice graphical interface. And what I'm doing is I'm storing all of the talks that I create inside of a card, inside of Trello. And then I can update those cards dynamically with comments based on people's feedback. I think this is really, really cool. Lots of people who have seen this talk are a little bit mind blown of having never thought to do this with Trello. So I think it's just kind of cool. It's one of those things where you're pulling a tool and you're just kind of figuring out how to make it fit to do what you want. This is probably not what I would do if this was a big scaled application, but it certainly works for this type of demo. So one of the code snippets that you'll see is Trello, like all of these other platforms, have an NPM package. So inside of JavaScript, if I want to create a card, which is representing a talk, I just call Trello.addCard, and then I give it a header, content, and then the list ID that I want to add that card to. In this case, I'm pulling that from an environment variable, but it will go ahead and create that card in Trello, and we'll see how that works in a second. All right, Netlify is going to be the platform that we use for hosting our site and then hosting our serverless functions all in one. This is, to me, by far the easiest way to get started with both, to host a static site and as well to host serverless functions. This is the easiest way to do it. Netlify is amazing. I rave about Netlify. I use it for all of my demos. I can't talk highly enough about it. It really is just super cool. So we're using Netlify in this case to host both just the regular site and then the serverless functions. And then just an example here of, if you look in the source code, and this is where if I was live on stage, I would have like a pointer and I would kind of point you in the right direction over here. But using my mouse under the functions directory, I've got 3 different files. These are all serverless functions. And the way this works in Netlify is if you check files into your source code and you specify which directory Netlify should look in for functions, it will grab each one of those functions and basically host it as an endpoint. So it uses the name of the file to then become the name of that endpoint. So they prefix them with .netlify/functions. So the first one would be .netlify/functions/add feedback, and then add talk, and then search tweets. Hint, hint at like the tweeting before with the hashtag and my handle. Please do that to participate in the demo. But this is an example of one of those functions. This is basically literally just defining a function, exports.handler, and then I'm using async here so I can do some async await. And then in this case, this is adding feedback to a card, and I'm just adding a comment to that card. I pass it the card ID, which card I'm working on, and then the comment, and then it responds back just like any other endpoint would with a status code and a response body. So this is all we have to do inside of our source code, and then Netlify will automatically pick this up, and then inside of the platform, you can see that it went ahead and created those 3 different functions for us, and it's hosting them, and we can check logs and that kind of stuff and see how many times they've been used. But all that stuff, the setup of this is just so easy. It's just really, really cool. I highly recommend people, if you ever look at serverless functions and you haven't before, just start by testing it out on Netlify. And then next up here, I mentioned I'm a champion for Twilio. So I really love the Twilio platform. And the thing that people know Twilio for most is just sending text messages. So what I'm using this for in this demo is when somebody sends a piece of feedback, I will get a text message if it works real time, which hopefully it does. And I'll try to turn on the audio or the ring to see if I can get that to come through the mic. We'll see if that works. But yeah, so when people send feedback, it will send me a text, and that will just kind of prompt me to go, hey, I need to go look at that card to see what somebody said. Twilio also, I don't know how long ago, bought a product called SendGrid for email, so you can send emails, and I could do the same thing. In this case, I'm just doing alerts for text messages. So like all the other platforms, there is an NPM package for JavaScript, and then after you initialize a client, so send a text, you call messages.create, you tell it what you want to send, you tell it from what number, which in this case is a number that you get from Twilio, and then you say which number are you sending to, which in this case is my number for this phone right here. And this is a little bit interesting. This last piece is really just to show off how dynamic, again, static sites can be. And this is going to basically allow us to query the Twitter API and ask for tweets that are associated with a specific hashtag. Hint, hint, the hashtag that we talked about earlier, which is JQQuickTalks. So what this function is going to do, the serverless function, is it's going to query the Twitter API. It's going to get tweets about that that hashtag, that include that hashtag. And then on the details page for one of those talks, it's going to real time dynamically call the serverless function to get those tweets and then display them. So again, this is where hopefully someone has gone through and done a tweet about this so we can see this in the demo. Otherwise, it will be a wild disappointment. But hopefully there's one of those to show. So inside of our search tweets serverless function, you get a client for Twitter. Again, just like all the other ones, you call .get, you call search tweets, and you tell it to query by a hashtag. And then obviously I'm passing in the hashtag JQQuickTalks here. So I actually, it looks like I have I copied and pasted a piece of text here that didn't mean to go into these slides. So this slide is specifically supposed to be for the source code. So on my GitHub, github.com/JamesQQuick /talk track is where you can find all the source code, and you can go and look through everything that you want and go and see what's out there. And then also I'll take a peek at some of the source code in a minute, and feel free to throw your questions in the chat of what kind of things specifically you would like to see. So I'm going to stop that. Let's get out of that. And then let's just go and take a look at the source code really quick. Now I'm just going to kind of breeze through this. The talk is not to show you every piece of code, but I do want to kind of hopefully make things relate to what we just talked about. So we talked about our functions, and what you saw on that screenshot is basically what you see here, in addition to the test that I haven't removed from the source code. But 3 different serverless functions, one for adding feedback, one for adding a talk, and then one for searching tweets. So let's start with the search tweets. And you can see in here, it's hard-coded to search for that JQQuickTalks hashtag. And after doing some initialization of the client for Twitter, after verifying the request is okay coming in, we search those tweets, and then we just respond back with those tweets. We also have the add feedback section. Now this is going to have a couple of different things in it. It's going to first parse out the body from the form of what people will submit with the feedback. It's going to add that card or add that comment to the Trello card. And then it's checking an environment variable, say if alerts are on, if text message alerts are on, go ahead and send that text message. So now you can see this is the snippet that we showed for Twilio. So this is where Twilio comes in, and I can send that text message to myself. And then I just return a status that says, good job, thanks for the feedback. And that's just, don't actually do anything with that in the client, just other than just knowing that request worked. And then to really briefly get into the security part, inside of the add talk, there's a few extra things in here where on any API, a very common way of doing validation of incoming requests is to use JWTs or JSON web tokens. And that could be a talk in itself. There's lots of details about JWTs and how they work. But basically what goes on here is when a user logs in the front end, AUTH0 will give them a JWT that they then pass along to the serverless function. And then I have some code in here to check the header for a valid token. So make sure that it can parse the token out of, it's the authorization header, and then it's a bearer token. So it's bearer space, and then the actual token string itself. Make sure that it can get that token out of there, and then have some logic to validate that this is a legit token, access token that came from AUTH0. And there you get into like public and private keys. AUTH0 will encrypt the JWT with the private key, and then we will decrypt it and validate it with a public key. So it's basically how that works without going into too much details. So after we grab and make sure that there's a valid token, then we check that token to see if there's the right permission. So in this case, not only am I validating that a legitimate user is making the request, I'm also validating that that user specifically has that access or that permission to do things like add talks. In this case, I'm the only one that has that permission. I haven't granted that to anyone else. So even if you try to log in or sign up at this application, you wouldn't be able to add talks yourself. All right, let me close out those. And then I want to show you the Gatsby node file. And again, this is basically at build time, we can customize what Gatsby does and where it gets its data. So if we look at the beginning of this, we get somewhere up here, we get a Trello client. So similar to what we did in our serverless functions. And then we use that to call get cards for lists. So for a given list, give me all the cards, which represent talks. And then unfortunately, the data inside of Trello is not optimized for key value pairs, although I think I could update this now that there's a new feature called custom properties or something in Trello. But in this case, I'm doing some just hacky parsing to get out the key value pairs. And then I go through and I use that content to create the page for each one of those talks, in this case. And then I also use that to generate the index page, which then uses all of the talks, all the talks in general, and then displays the list of talks. So hopefully that makes sense so far, just in terms of code. I can show you really quickly inside of Trello. This is Trello if you've never used it before. I've got a table over here, or a list of talks. And inside of here, you can see these are all the different times that I've given this talk. And you can see inside of basically just the description field, here's all those key value pairs of information that I care about. So again, I have to manually parse this stuff, which is not ideal, but I think they have custom fields here where you could add these as basically just like built-in fields in the GUI. Trello is super nice. Using it as a GUI is super nice. I think after adding these as custom fields, this whole process will get even that much easier. But for now, it works fine with just doing some manual parsing. So that's where all of that information is. Now I want to open up the application, and I'll throw this in the chat if you want to check it out. And actually, I would highly encourage you to. It's at talktrack.netlify.app. Netlify actually recently switched over their domains from .com to .app. So this is the demo, and inside of here, you can see a list of all of the talks that I've got a piece of dummy data in there too. Let me refresh this page because I think it should be gone after refreshing. Yeah, there we go. So you can see this is basically all the information that correlates to all of those cards that were in Trello. So you can see it's pulling that information, and then this is a static page where it pulled that information, it generated this page, and then you can go to the details for one of these by clicking on it. So then you can see the full description here. You can see the slides. Then you get access to doing feedback. And I'll show you another piece here in a second as well. So let me go back to the home page. And what I'm going to do is log in here. I feel like with sharing my page, everything's a little bit delayed. Or the login button just broke, maybe. I think everything is really delayed here. Oh, rats. I've had this issue a couple times. Let me try to do a rebuild of this because sometimes the build in here does something weird. Let me trigger a rebuild. And while this is running, I do want to mention one more thing. Or I'll go ahead and show you, on each of these individual pages, there is the how did I do section. So this is where you can provide feedback, and it takes that information and posts it to the serverless function, which then interacts with Trello. And then hopefully in a second, we'll send me a text message as well. And I think someone's already actually sent feedback on one of the other talks. So not the one that I'm going to create, hopefully, if this demo works. But I've got a text message in here. You probably can't see that from Twilio to show that someone did that. So thank you, whoever it was that participated. And then I do just want to say, if you remember back to talking about how static sites work or static site generators work, after hopefully I'm able to log in and then add this new record to Trello, there needs to be a build process for the site to then pick up on the fact that there's a new piece of data out there in Trello, because it only interacts with Trello in terms of reading those cards at build time. So you have to trigger another build. So let me see if this is running. It says site is live. Let's try to refresh on here. And then let me try to log in. Looks like that's still being difficult. Let me see if I have this running locally. And this will accomplish the same thing. Let me see if that will work here. All right, so I'm already logged in on the local version. I've got it running. Let me go ahead and add a talk. And this will be static sites and serverless functions. You can tell I've done this before. And this will be JavaScript and Friends Meetup. You can tell I've done that before for testing. And then we are May 12th. And then the slides in here, I'm going to just grab from the previous input, which is here. And then the description you have on the JavaScript and Friends description. So I'm just going to say super cool site. And so what's going to happen is this is going to submit that record to Trello, which is this way. And we should see now that we have a new record in here in Trello. So that thing made it all the way. I just got another text message, or maybe it's the same one, but an alert on my watch for the text from Twilio. But I just added that new talk. And then remember, we talked about there needs to be now a build process to then see that new talk in the home page. So if I look in Netlify and come back over to my deploys, we should see that this is currently building. And that's because inside of our code, and I skipped over this earlier, in the add talk section, I make a call to, let's see here, to the Netlify build hook. So as I add a new talk, it then triggers a build in Netlify, and then this should go and do a complete rebuild of the site. Now we'll see if this is able, I don't know what's going on with the login there. Something's going on, but if this build finishes, hopefully we'll see that it will pull up that information. So site is live. Now let's go over to the site, the real one. Let's refresh. We see the new data has popped up because it went through the build process and grabbed that new record out of Trello. And then you can click on this. And then now, as part of the demo, if someone can head over there, and I'm going to try to have my volume loud enough to hear text messages. Hopefully I don't get any personal attacks. And I don't know how long I'll wait just in case. But if someone can, just for feedback or just for testing wise, if someone can go to this URL and just leave a comment inside of the feedback, it doesn't have to be real, just anything. Hopefully we'll see a text message come up here in a second. So I'll give a second if anyone will kind of indulge me and do that. And there was, was that loud enough to hear? Somebody in the chat can let me know. Hopefully it was. But that was the text message that came from Twilio. And it's not going to be great to see on there. Heard it? Cool. Awesome that you heard it. So there's a couple of ones that came through, which is really nice. And I can scroll over back to Trello, and inside of here, I can see that now I have the comments. So for each one that's coming in, it then creates the comment on that card. So I can go back and still look through all the feedback. It's basically a database of feedback. I can go through and look at all of it, which is super cool. And the last thing I want to show, you may have already seen this. If you scroll down on this page, what it does is it dynamically calls the serverless function to ask for relevant tweets that include the hashtag JQQuickTalks. And now if you have participated in this, which a couple people that are at least in the Zoom have, you can see that it's pulling, like a static site is real time able to pull that information based on, or because of having those serverless functions out there to do kind of the heavy lifting. Now this is just a lightweight front end client. It's able to call the backend serverless function API. That thing can go and get all the information we need and then go ahead and display it inside of our static page, which is actually really, really dynamic. So hopefully that is pretty cool. I get really excited about this talk, again, just because there's so many different cool technologies out there. You figure out how to throw them together and you can really build some powerful stuff. This is obviously a demo, but there's nothing to say that I couldn't take this and really make this the platform where I track every talk that I give and add a lot of extra features and things to it. All right, I've got just a couple of slides here to wrap up, and then we'll pause officially for questions if people have them. So let me go back into presentation mode, and just a couple of last thoughts here for representing AUTH0 here in talking, and that's the big benefit of being a developer advocate, is just being a part of the community and being able to give talks and things like that. Just wanted to give you an FYI on how you can get involved at AUTH0. So the first thing is we have an ambassador program, which Bhaskara is a part of, which is great. And so this is an ambassador program where we give lots of support to our ambassadors. We pay for them to travel, in theory, if it's a different time, to travel and speak about topics that are related to identity, not necessarily AUTH0 specific, but just kind of identity in general. And then we do some training sessions and things and try to keep engaged with our ambassadors. So if you're interested in that, there's the link for the ambassador program. We also have the Auth0 blog. So if you're interested in writing blog articles on a platform that gets, I don't know the numbers right offhand, but gets lots of visits to the Auth0 blog, and they pay you for it as well, that's an option. And then lastly is I've been doing a lot of live streams for personal channel, but then also we've been doing the Auth0 channel and growing that on Twitch as well. So if you have a cool topic that you're interested in and you'd want to come on the Auth0 channel or on my personal channel, you can reach out to me for that as well. And you can check out for reference on twitch.tv/JamesQQuick, or Auth0 is the Auth0 channel as well. And then one personal note I wanted to mention is if the stuff that we talked about today with serverless functions and some of the React stuff interested you and you're interested in learning more about it, I'm working on a course that I'm releasing at the end of May 27th, called React and Serverless Full Stack Web Development. And it's going to talk about everything that we just kind of breezed over: serverless functions, how to host them, how to call them, how to interact with them, security, authentication, authorization, working with Auth0 and JWTs, and all this fun stuff, which I think is really, really cool. So if you're interested in that, on my site at jamesqquick.com/courses, the first one there is listed for React and Serverless. And then there's a sign up. So if you sign up for that pre-launch email, I'll send a 50% off discount to all the people that are signed up there. So you can check that out as well. And then lastly, before we officially stop and ask questions, which I've got plenty of time for if you have any, I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to be here. Thanks that we still have opportunities to be engaged, even though we're completely remote now and haven't traveled in a while. And then lastly, if you have questions or want to reach out to me at any time later on, James Q Quick on social media, and then James Q Quick for my site. And there's a contact page and basic stuff there if you have anything that you want to follow up on. So I don't know, I guess for people that are in the Zoom, feel free to come off mute, I think, and ask away if you have any questions.
Thank you, James. It was really a cool demo with all the serverless options with Trello and also using Auth0 and Twilio. So it is very easy whenever we use these functions to get them hooked to our website and add some additional functionalities as well.
Yeah, I get so excited about it. I think it's so much fun.
Yeah, I think now we are open for questions. Feel free to send in your questions either through chat, or you can always unmute yourself and ask James those questions as well.
Yep. Now we gotta wait for whoever the bravest person is to ask a first question.
Yep. So we have a question on Twitch, James, how can I validate routes for specific roles using the Jamstack?
So let me pull open the source code. So it talks about this a little bit, although obviously moved pretty fast. So inside of my add talk route, the basic idea is I'm using JSON web tokens to validate a user and their permissions. So on the front end in Gatsby in React, the user logs in through Auth0. Auth0 then returns a JWT, a JSON web token. And then in the request to the backend, that access token is included in that request. So inside of the add talk one, this is specifically one where I want to track that not everyone can do it. I want to make sure it's the right type of user. Inside of add talk, I'm trying to find my cursor here. It's invisible on my screen. All right, maybe I won't scroll down. But we pull out that access token from the headers, the authorization header. We then validate that access token using the JSON web token library, and we call validate or verify, I think. And you pass it two things. One is the token string itself. The second thing is a public key that I can use to validate it. So all of that logic of specifically how it does it is abstracted away. But after validating, then we get basically the information out of that token, and we can check in that token whether or not the user has certain permissions. When you mention routes, if you're talking about front-end routes as well, so on the front end in Gatsby and React and anything you want really, we have a nice library called the Auth0-spa-js library. And in React specifically, it gives you hooks to have really easy access to things like, is the user authenticated, what the user object is. And then based on that, you can protect different routes in the front end, and then similar type of thing in the back end with parsing and validating the JWT, the access token that comes to the server. A comment in the Zoom chat. Thanks for the information. Netlify was new to me. I use AWS all the time, but this seems easier. Yes, it's a lot easier. I think they've got some tools in AWS to help make the process relatively easy as well, but I've never seen anything as easy as this. Netlify, how they abstract away AWS, like you don't care that it's AWS honestly at all. You just need to know how to write that function and include it in your source code, and that's really all you have to worry about. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of serverless, specifically in the context of doing it with Netlify because of how easy it is. So yeah, I'm glad you got that message out of this talk.
Yeah, on Twitch as well, we have a question like, from your experience between AWS Lambda or Azure Functions or Google Cloud Functions, which is the best one do you recommend?
I don't have experience on those platforms per se, so I can't really talk to that from my perspective. I've really just focused on the Netlify side. So again, the only thing I can really say is just how easy it is to get up and running. But I'm sure there's tools that are pretty similar on each of those platforms. I had looked at like Azure Functions years ago when I worked at Microsoft. That was 5 or 6 years ago at this point. And it was a similar type of thing, right? The similar idea. But Netlify has been so easy. I did a live stream a week and a half ago with someone who walked me through how to set up serverless functions in AWS from scratch, not using some of the built-in tools that abstract some of that stuff away from you. And the manual process of how many things there were to do was really, really tedious and really overwhelming for someone who is not really into DevOps. So the fact that all that stuff is abstracted away from me completely, and as a developer, all I have to do is write and check in code is the reason that I've gone the way that I've gone. But I can't really confirm or deny on other platforms what it's like.
Yeah, so in my experience, I feel like Azure Functions or AWS Lambda or Google Cloud Functions, they are more likely to use if you are developing some enterprise APIs or enterprise related applications. Whereas when you come to the serverless options with Netlify, it is basically to add some additional features. Like, let's say you have something you have on a portal, and if you want to get it automatically added to your static website whenever there is a new information on that. So that's where I think Netlify functions would come well to use, is my understanding.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, like in the enterprise scenario, people make a living off of using AWS, and there's all these different services in AWS. So as a company, if you're an AWS shop, like that's what you use, that's what you're going to gravitate to. If you use everything Google Cloud, that's what you're going to gravitate to. If you're a .NET shop and you use Azure, that's what you're going to gravitate to. The benefit of staying within one of those platforms is the integration with the other different tools. So for instance, in AWS, integrating a serverless function with an S3 bucket or just whatever the different services are that they have, they're obviously going to make those integrations as easy as possible. So yeah, I totally agree. If you're already in that ecosystem, then it probably makes sense to just continue it. I think this is specifically just the easiest way for someone that's brand new to this whole thing and just kind of wants to build an app that also has backend functionality as easy as possible and not have to worry about any of the hosting or setup or configuration.
Yeah.
I'm
So
curious
any
if
other
anyone,
questions do we have?
yeah, I was wondering if anyone was going to come off mute to ask a question in the Zoom chat. If not, that's totally fine.
Yep.
So, okay, here's a question then. Are all these static pages being hosted on Netlify itself?
Yes. Yep. And I didn't show that aspect of it. So let me scroll back over through my windows too. My cursor is just not showing. Maybe I won't do this. My cursor is like disappeared on my computer. Let me see. All right, so there it is. And then now it's back. That's really weird. So inside of Netlify, you can't actually see the individual files, but all of those files. So what happens in Netlify is there's a build process. So when I check in code to my master branch, continuous integration is set up with like basically no configuration in Netlify. But I tell it two things. I tell it a build command to run, which is like a Gatsby build. And then I tell it what the public directory is to serve. So if you run like a React build or a Vue build or an Angular build, or in this case, a Gatsby build, the output of that is a static set of files, and they usually go into like a dist directory or a public directory or something like that. So inside, I think of my deploy settings, you can see that my build command is Gatsby build, and then my public directory, which is where those files get put after they go through the build process, is the public directory. So Netlify is also like a CDN, so it can replicate these files all across the world. So it makes it as quick as possible for people across the world to access the site. But yes, those static sites or static files are hosted in there, as well as in the functions tab up here. You can see that it shows you the functions that it's picked up as well, just from the source code. And then those are hosted behind the scenes in AWS, but you have the ability to go in and look at logs and basic things like that. And that's the benefit, or one of the big benefits of this whole thing is I've done, like for demos, I've done a lot of Node, like creating my own Node server to do whatever, to build a basic API. But then hosting of that becomes a lot more complicated. You can go to something like Heroku is probably the easiest way to do it, or like DigitalOcean. But with DigitalOcean, there's still like extra configurations and things that you have to do. So there's just extra work to make that happen. So that's why for me, just jumping to the serverless functions and only writing code and just having it checked in. And when I talked about the development experience originally early on in the talk, that's why it's such a big positive for me, because I'm just writing code as a developer. I'm not distracted with DevOps and deployments and things like that. Continuous integration is set up, and I'm basically done at that point. Thanks for coming off mute and asking a question, by the way. And thanks for everyone who tweeted and sent feedback. The demo doesn't really work if people don't participate, so I really appreciate that.
Yep. Thanks, James. So if we don't have any other questions, you can always reach out to James on Twitter, and James is always active. So feel free to reach out to him if you have any further follow-up questions. And we'll also share the slide details, and we will also post this talk to our YouTube channel. Thank you all for joining, and stay safe over there.
Sweet. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.